Ready, we'll go ahead and get started. If people circle in, they do, they don't, that's on them. So a couple quick things before we get going. One is that there are still a couple student-run projects collecting data on Sonos. So if you want some extra credit, want to help out your fellow students, go ahead and do that. And the next is, we don't have that much time left in the semester. I was just looking at it. So we have this week when we'll be talking about, well, we're gonna wrap up juries today with an assignment. Then we'll be doing, impact on victims. That'll probably go over into next Tuesday. And then this Thursday we have class, but a week from Thursday we don't because of the academic symposium. And then we just have one more class. So it's a little like mind boggling. So that being said, be thinking about your interview paper if you haven't gotten that in yet. Be thinking about that service learning paper. And again, if all of your efforts to do service learning have been thwarted, I know that happens to folks. You can use a previous experience you've had. So don't forget that. I know several people are already writing the assignment about that. So yeah, that is definitely open to that. And so then our presentation time, well, our exam time is scheduled for Friday the 5th at 11:30 a.m. We'll meet here and have y'all do your presentations. These are like 5 minutes. You can do a PowerPoint. In the past, a lot of people just talked. I remember there was one year where I taught this class at night and we were in the SSL and we just like sat in a circle and went around, and that worked out really nicely. It was a nice vibe. So like whatever you're most comfortable with presenting, that format is fine. It's basically just sharing with your classmates what you've been doing all semester or what you've done previously and how you're reflecting and tying it to this particular course. Just looking to see who else may have signed in on our Zoom here. Alrighty. Okay, so we are going to start with this assignment today. Since we have a few people here today, we'll just do 3 groups. So folks on Zoom, you're gonna be, I'll make you group 1 since you'll be breakout room 1, and that'll just like make sense. And then I'll have the 3 of y'all be group 2, and then the 3 folks across the back. When she gets back, she can join y'all. It'll be group 3. And so again, this is on Blackboard. This is assignment 8. And have y'all work through that. And I'm going to go ahead and get the folks on Zoom into a breakout room. So you will be all put into the same breakout room, and then it should just move you. Yep. Alrighty. And again, please feel free to chat with each other rather than just working on it independently. And you're with the group across the. Yep. Then we have 3 and 3. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't really have this going up a couple times, but the boy, who was on trial, he was Latinx, he was Latino. And so that's when they're talking about like those people, that's what they're talking about. Hey, Casey and Trinity, I just saw that y'all joined. I only have one breakout room. And since people are probably about halfway through the assignment, I'm just gonna put you in there and you can help out that way. Oh my goodness. Sorry.
bring our breakout room folks back. Alrighty, welcome back to breakout room, folks. It looked like most people were done, but if you need to keep typing anything as we start, feel free. And just to like make things a little more efficient today, I'll just kind of go through and do answers from each group here. So for the first question, does the depiction of the jury in 12 Angry Men make juries appear to be competent? Why or why not? And so group one said they did not appear to be competent. All the jurors besides one had decided the boy was guilty before their discussion even began. It's important that juries approach cases with the concept that people are innocent until proven guilty. Yeah, I think that's really important, right? In group two, for extra legal information, the defendant on trial was a young Latino boy, and he was referred to as those people quite a few times, right, by different people. And the age of the boy comes into play because he's so young, but the prejudice of the jurors shows when they automatically come to that guilty verdict, except for again, that first or the juror here. What evidence do you see for or against jurors' ability to decide complex cases? The evidence was because he was a Latino, the jurors automatically assumed he was guilty. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have some problems. The juror who said not guilty first tried not to have any bias and kept saying it's possible. And that's what you should do in these cases. Yeah, that's one of the good abilities to be a juror. And people who decide complex cases need to test all possibilities about the cases. Otherwise, they could miss some important points. They didn't think of the train noise at first, which was an important point. Yeah. And the juror who said guilty originally was allowing himself to judge the circumstances through an unbiased lens, which does show great qualities in determining the proper outcome of complex cases like this one. With one juror having a different opinion, it helps the jury deliberate more openly. Yeah, so they like looked at the evidence, which they wouldn't have done, right? In terms of juror bias was a major issue. It led to a huge argument between the jurors. When a jury deliberates with one another, they have to take into account the evidence that presented in court and discuss the case. But in this movie, most of the jurors had made up their mind. Yeah. And then in terms of how would the members of your group feel you would have voted to convict someone of a crime that there must be no reasonable doubt as to if they committed said crime. There are many forms of exculpatory evidence, nice use of vocab term, provided by the defense team. But one factor standing out was the witnesses needing glasses and her eyesight during the crime being in question gives enough reasonable doubt not to convict. Her testimony was one of the main reasons for the jurors wanting to convict. Yeah. Yeah, and this is really important too, right? And I love that they brought this up during their deliberation, the idea that sometimes the lawyers are just public defendants, right? They don't have that much time to prepare on the case. They don't have that much energy to devote to the case. And so you might not get the best presentation of things. Excellent job, y'all. Okay. So what we're going to start talking about today is the psychology of victims. And I'm going to go ahead and get us into slideshow mode here and muck with our captions to get the better captions. Hang on just a second. And then just start this with just a little bit of caveat that a couple different things. One is that we're going to use the term victims because that's the legal term for the person for which against which a crime was perpetrated. But that a lot of people who are
victims of these types of crimes we're gonna talk about specifically, like to refer to themselves as survivors. That they're someone who survived this, they weren't victimized by it. Again, that being said, within the legal system, they are defined as victims. And then the other caveat, obviously, is that we are going to talk about sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment. I know for some people, this will bring some stuff up for you. So if you need to like step out at any point, I don't need to know you're not just going to the bathroom, just like whatever you need to do. And that I'm also here if anyone does need to touch base after our class today. So, while most individuals feel sympathy towards victims who have experienced crime and or violence, sometimes others will blame the victims for their plight. One of the reasons for this inclination is the need to believe in a just world. This is called the just world hypothesis. This is the idea that good things happen to good people, and therefore bad things can only happen to bad people. And therefore, if you are the victim of a crime, you must somehow be bad because you brought it on yourself. Doing so helps people to separate themselves, right? If you can point to something that victim did and say, well, I'd never do that, wear that, stay there, then you can say, therefore, it won't happen to me, right? System justification theory basically says, even when it's oppressive to them, a lot of times people have a lot of, on the vote, like a lot of emphasis behind reason to support the status quo. And whether that's the government, whether that is, political beliefs, whether that is just beliefs about victim blaming, even when it's to their disadvantage, people tend to buy into the overarching theme. And this is why we see people having internalized sexism or racism or internalized homophobia, people, voting against their own interests sometimes, things along those lines, right? The problem obviously is that these types of responses where we're blaming the victims, we're saying they're a bad person, the system is right, leads to response to victims that's not always very supportive, right? I don't know if any of you all read the Virginian Pilots or like get news alerts from them, but they have a big article they just published yesterday talking about students up at Christopher Newport and how going through their Title IX process, they felt like victimized them more, sort of re-traumatized them. But there are probably a lot of people on that campus who would say, no, our system's great, right? And that's that system justification. So this shapes our responses to victims because if people are responsible for their own suffering, we feel less obligated to help them, to dedicate resources to them. So types of victims. In 2006, approximately 25 million criminal victimizations occurred. More than 18.9 million involved property crimes. So that was 160 incidents per 1,000 households. This is having something stolen from you, something along those lines. You're still a victim of a crime then, right? We came out one morning in 2020 ending in peak 2020 fashion. A couple weeks before Christmas, looked in our driveway and my husband's car was just gone. Someone had stolen it out of our driveway. And both our friend who's a Virginia Beach cop and the cop who responded to the scene told us, yeah, these guys basically just take them and like drive them where they need to go and leave them there. We were like, actually it was my mom who was like, so they use it like an Uber? And I was like, I guess so. Right? That even though neither of us was physically harmed, that still feels very violating, right? Having your house broken into, being mugged, things along those lines. Over 6.1 million were victims of crimes of violence. Bless you. And this is 25 incidents per 1,000 persons, and these can include things like the things we're going to talk about in more detail, like sexual assault, like domestic violence, but it can also include things like assault and battery, mugging that's violent, things along those lines. And so acts of racial or religious discrimination also occur with some frequency. About 90% of gay men report having been threatened or subject to verbal abuse. And more than 33% of gay men were victims of violence. And that's certainly true to other members of the LGBTQ+ community, other members of other minoritized groups. Recently, many have acknowledged the need to recognize and serve victims of crimes. So from the late 1970s, the interdisciplinary field of victimology has emerged. There's increasing availability of services to crime victims, including compensation, access to therapy, things along those lines. There's an expanded opportunity for victims to participate in the trials of their victimizers. And there's a heightened focus on victims brought about within the field by new journals. And I would say, especially within the past 10 years or so, within the public by some very cutting documentary series or standalone documentaries. So I think of things like The Invisible War, which is a documentary about military sexual trauma, The Hunting Ground, which was a documentary about sexual trauma on college campuses. You think about all the various documentaries about cults. I just finished watching like all 3 seasons of the R. Kelly docuseries, right? And so this is becoming more part of the public consciousness. That doesn't mean we're always great at how we treat those victims, though. So some of the consequences of victimization were originally studied by Widom in 1989, and in particular, early victimization. So abused or neglected children were significantly more likely to have been arrested for violent crimes later in life as either juveniles or adults. And they did this like looking at a matched comparison group. So we know that being a victim has psychological consequences, has behavioral consequences, which in turn lead to consequences for our healthcare system, our legal system, and potential future victims, right? Unfortunately, many of the people who themselves abuse others were abused as children. And so the official psychological diagnosis that a lot, but not all, of folks who are victims, survivors, end up getting is post-traumatic stress disorder. And just before I go into more details about this, this is sort of interesting because for a long time, they thought PTSD was only a diagnosis you could give to military survivors of trauma. And it really wasn't until around the same time victimology was coming into play as a field that people started acknowledging like, oh, we're seeing the exact same symptoms in people who are victims of violent crimes, particularly things that are personal violations like sexual assault. Interestingly, it also meant that like for a long time, we didn't apply the diagnosis to people who had been in like violent car accidents who also have trauma, obviously, or natural disasters. So we've expanded who it applies to, and that means those folks have access to some of the best treatments that we have out there. And so the symptoms here, and these are from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which is what we use here in the US to diagnose. So again, the first thing you have to get PTSD is a history of a trauma. We call this a criterion A event. So it's exposure to a traumatic event actual or threatened, and you know, having experienced, witnessed, or confronted events with actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation to yourself or someone else. So if you see someone close to you die, for example, like you don't obviously have to die to get the diagnosis. One of the really interesting things I liked that they added to the DSM-5 back in 2013 is that media exposure for your work can count now. So for example, when I was at the VA back in 2009, 2010, I had a Navy vet I was working with who his job during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars was to sit in a tent all day with a wall of computer screens in front of him and watch every bit of helmet footage, body cam footage. And so he was watching like market bombings and their aftermath, or people going on raids and things along those lines. And at the time, we diagnosed him with PTSD, even though it didn't technically fit under the umbrella. But now they acknowledge that within the diagnosis, which I think is really good. And then you have to have at least one of these intrusive symptoms. A lot of people with PTSD have multiple of these symptoms. So recurrent involuntary and distressing memories, they'll just kind of pop up out of nowhere, memories of the event. Recurrent distressing dreams, and we could just call them nightmares, right? Dissociative reactions such as flashbacks. So if you're not familiar with what flashbacks are, this is where the person gets some reminder of the trauma and actually feels and sometimes acts like they're back in the traumatic moment. So for vets from Vietnam era, they hear a car backfire, they hit the deck. So then that sounds like a gunshot. Vets from like OEF, OIF, something will remind them while they're driving, and all of a sudden they start driving down the middle of the road, like straddling the yellow line, because that's how you had to drive so that you didn't run into improvised explosive devices on the roadside. For someone who is the survivor of sexual trauma, it might be while they're having a consensual sexual encounter, and then they feel like they're being re-victimized in the moment. Significant or distress or exposure to cues of the events, and this can be really difficult, obviously, depending on your work environment, your school environment, where the event took place, right? So I worked with military sexual trauma survivors, and some of them had been assaulted at their place of work. And so going back to the office was really hard. And then physiological reactions to reminders of the events, heart rate increase, breathing more shallowly, essentially a lot of the same symptoms you get in response to a panic attack. Some people, depending on the nature of the crime, will actually become like physically ill, vomit when things come back up. They will go out of their way to avoid reminders of the event. Again, this can be really difficult depending on where you work. I had a young vet who had out-processed from the military but was still working for the Army Civil Service. And he left the room anytime they talked about the war in Iraq. Well, he was working for the Army. They talked about it a lot, right? And it was starting to really get in the way of him being able to work. Negative changes in their thoughts, cognitions, and moods, like the inability to remember important aspects of the events. And actually later in this lecture, we'll talk about what happens in the brain to make you forget it. Exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself, or persistent negative emotions. They'll also exhibit marked changes in arousal and reactivity. Like hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is like always being on your guard, always sort of scanning your environment. And even people who don't have PTSD, who have like a military or police background, will have this as just like a trait. So if you have friends or family members who are current or former military or police, law enforcement, you might notice that when you go into a restaurant, they want to sit like in a corner. And they want to sit with their back to the wall so they can kind of watch everybody and no one can sneak up on them. I had, in addition to PTSD, one of the big injuries a lot of the folks from Iraq, Afghanistan came back with was back and knee problems because they carried like 100 pounds of gear while walking around the desert. And I had a vet who had severe knee pain, but still patrolled his several acre property every night as part of his hypervigilance. And then the other thing that you can have is exaggerated startle response. So if someone does happen to sneak up on you, you jump a mile. Or one of my friends saw that his kiddo came and woke him up. He didn't know where he was. He grabbed his kid by the throat. Now he didn't injure his kid, but obviously that could have gone south. And so they had to teach the kiddo, like, don't wake daddy up when he's sleeping. And then sleep disturbances, things like insomnia, trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep. And obviously if that's paired with the nightmares, that even confounds it. And then you've got to have significant distress or impairment with symptoms lasting more than a month. And one of the things I really appreciate about how the diagnosis for PTSD is written is that it doesn't matter when symptoms start. So they could start immediately after the trauma. It could take a while to sink in. We had vets when I was at the VA in 2009, 2010, who were in the Vietnam War. So late 60s, early 70s. And were just coming in to get diagnosed with PTSD. Some of them because they had been self-medicating with alcohol for years and had just gotten clean, and then all their symptoms came up. So obviously this can apply to anyone who is a victim of a violent crime. So how common is PTSD? Resnick et al. Back in 1993 found that 12% of a sample of women had symptoms of PTSD at some point in their lives, and 4.6% were currently suffering from PTSD. Recent estimates place the rate of PTSD among Iraq war vets at somewhere between 12 and 20%. In general, with a trauma, it's somewhere around 8 to 10%. And if you're wounded in combat, you're like 20% of people who are wounded in combat develop PTSD. 50% of people who are sexually assaulted develop PTSD. Same percentage for prisoners of war. About 50% of people who were held as prisoner of war develop PTSD. So that, again, to me really speaks to the profound violation you feel when you've been sexually assaulted. And then vets who had repeated high levels of combat exposure in Vietnam, about 60% of them developed PTSD. So about 26% of women whose trauma was related to crime developed PTSD. And only 9% of women who had sustained a non-criminal trauma developed PTSD. So again, that sense of violation seems to really play into it here. We see that women are slightly more likely to develop PTSD than men. So we do see that it's a ratio of about 2 to 1. And so after a trauma, about 20% of women will develop PTSD and 8% of men. And then some events, as we've just been hinting at, combat, disasters, abuse, victimization, are more likely to cause PTSD than other traumatic events. Women who were injured by a trauma in particular are more likely to develop PTSD symptoms, and the belief that the victim's life is in danger, that they have no control over the trauma, increases that risk for PTSD. These are some updated stats. I guess these are sort of bleeding with some of the stuff I was talking about as well. And so in terms of, well, what about right after, you have this trauma, right? You have to have these symptoms for a month before you can be diagnosed. Well, there is another disorder you can be diagnosed with called acute stress disorder. And these are trauma-related symptoms that last less than a month, or it can be diagnosed within that first month after a trauma, and then after a month has gone by, if they still have symptoms, the diagnosis can change to PTSD. Interestingly, though, a lot of the folks who come in with acute stress disorder don't necessarily go on to develop PTSD. I think largely because they've come in for help right away, right? So they get help right away. One reason why not everybody who experiences trauma develops PTSD may be that those experiencing trauma but not developing PTSD tend to receive high levels of social support immediately following the event. So friends, family, co-workers, fellow service members, they will be supportive. Individuals who do develop PTSD often perceive the world as a dangerous place from which they must retreat, and they come to view themselves as helpless to deal with stressors. Edna Foa has developed a type of therapy designed to really address these particular misconceptions. And she initially developed it for women who had been sexually assaulted, but it's actually been applicable to many different people who have an experience of trauma. And so Foa includes the following in her therapy, which is called cognitive processing therapy. So the first thing is education about common psychological reactions to trauma, but also to assault more specifically, to help victims realize their responses are normal. Training in skills such as relaxation. Emotionally reliving the trauma through imagery-based exposure methods to allow victims to diffuse their fears of the trauma. So in CPT, how this plays out is you have the person write out their traumatic experience, and then they read it out loud in therapy. And then cognitive restructuring to help people replace negative beliefs about their competence and adequacy with more realistic appraisals. So challenging some of the thoughts they have about the world not being safe or this being their fault. And victims who completed this therapy had fewer PTSD symptoms than people who had not received treatment. So again, getting help, seeking help helps diminish that. So these are some of the myths and stereotypes about rape in particular. We're going to start talking about rape in particular. So that women can't be raped against their will. The whole definition of rape is it's against your will. So that one boggles my mind. That women wish to be raped. What? And that most accusations of rape are faked. So if I throw it to y'all, what would you guess would be the percentage of rape reports that end up being false? 2% is actually accurate, so right on. But a lot of people, when I throw this out, will say 80%, 50%, because we tend to see those more in the media. But yeah, it's 2 to 8%, which is the same percentage as any other crime. So people also lie about being robbed or things along those lines. And so it's not that most are fakes, right? And in fact, one of the things that we'll learn as we go through this is that rape is one of the least reported crimes, primarily because the victims believe no one will believe them. So Field did some research in this area, and he concluded that there are 7 different attitude clusters that contribute to our overall perception of rape itself, but also the victims of rape. So among Field's factors are the degree to which women are seen as responsible for preventing their own rape, a desire for sex is seen as the main motive. It certainly can be part of rape, but in a lot of cases, these events are more about power, showing power and control over the other person. Severe punishment is advocated for rapists, and a woman is seen as an instigating rape through flirtatious behavior or provocative dress. And again, like in the year of our Lord 2023, we would really hope That's not a thing. But unfortunately, people still say this shit. And it's really upsetting, not only to those of us who are just learning about it, but clearly to survivors as well. And so what accounts, and this is supposed to be ideology, but ideologue kind of works, I guess. Go ahead and fix that real quick. The typos you make. But there is this ideology that can lead us to sort of these misconceptions that we have. So some have an ideology that encourages the acceptance of myths about rape, and this was first studied by Burt back in the 80s. And that's why it sort of boggles me that like the idea that like rape myths are still believed and we haven't really done it that much to combat them, 40 years later, right, is really problematic. But the theology or the ideology here embraces the following beliefs. So sexual conservatism, the idea that sex is something that is dirty and wrong, and therefore you should save it for marriage. Again, I don't think that anyone's decisions about when they have sex and with whom are mine to judge, right? So if people want to wait till marriage, great. If people don't want to wait till marriage, great, right? But this is part of it. Adversarial sexual beliefs, and some of these may start to sound really familiar if you're familiar with the group of folks online who refer to themselves as incels, involuntarily celibate. They see sex, and people in general who believe these myths see sex as like something women are withholding from men in some way, that men are owed. That's problematic. That somehow this is like a battle or a negotiation. Acceptance of interpersonal violence, right? Some people will just be like, yeah, it's fine if a parent like punches their kid out, things along those lines. And sexual stereotyping, the idea that women should be very feminine, men should be very masculine. Anything that sort of undercuts that is seen as really problematic. There's a lot of like homophobia in that as well, right? And the idea about women being passive and men being active or aggressive. Those who are more tolerant of rape, or we sometimes refer to them as rape apologists, they're just like, oh no, it's men can't control themselves, which I think is more of an insult to men than women, to be perfectly honest. But they're likely to have these traditional beliefs about gender roles. The woman should stay home, the man should be the one who is the breadwinner, things along those lines. They tend to have greater needs for power and dominance, more adversarial sexual beliefs, and then also heightened expressions of aggressiveness and anger. So even if they are not perpetrators themselves, they share some behavioral traits with perpetrators. Unfortunately, the United States has one of the highest rates of forcible rape among the world's industrialized countries. So between 75 and 85 forcible rapes are reported annually to the police for every 100,000 females. That's how many are reported. A lot of people do not report. So several clients that I saw who were in their 30s and their 40s, I was the first person they'd ever told they've been sexually assaulted or sexually abused as a child. So a lot of people just aren't telling anyone, much less the police. According to the National Violence Against Women survey, which was in 2000, 17.6% of all women said they'd been the victim of rape or attempted rape. And 21.6% of these women said they were younger than 12 years old at the time of their first rape. Unfortunately, survivors of rape are often re-victimized. Among rape victims, so those who did endorse having been a victim of rape, 31.5% reported being physically injured in some way during their rape. About 18 million women and 3 million men in the US have been raped. So this does happen to men. And missing from these statistics, because they are from the 2000s when people weren't taking this into account, are non-binary and trans individuals who unfortunately are raped at much higher rates, as are gay and lesbian individuals and bisexual individuals. There's this term called corrective rape, where people who hold these beliefs think that if I sexually assault someone, somehow that will magically make them straight or cisgendered. Not gonna work, right? And women who reported being raped as minors were twice as likely to report being raped as adults. And I think the biggest reason for that is, unfortunately, most rapists are serial rapists. So I think it's over 90% of rapes are by serial rapists, someone who's raped more than one person. And these types of people search out people who are vulnerable. And obviously, if you're a survivor of childhood sexual abuse or rape, you are more vulnerable. And according to this same study, only 19% of women and 13% of the men who were raped after age 18 said they reported it to the police. Yeah, right. So that's quite a few that are not being reported. So why are these rates low of reporting? Well, victims think that reporting won't help. They think it won't go anywhere. No one will believe them. To give you an example of this, until I want to say 2014 or 2015, there was a law on the books in Norfolk, which we tend to think of as like one of the more liberal cities in the 7 cities, saying that rape victims should be assumed to be lying. That you should assume that if someone comes to you and says they're raped, they're lying until proven otherwise. Yeah. So like laws like that exist. The other problem too is that for years and years and years, again, fairly recently it's been revised, but the FBI definition of rape was like forcible penile vaginal penetration. And like rape, sexual assault encompass so much more than that, right? Also, victims often think they would suffer further embarrassment as the result of reporting. And as I mentioned, they often think that like officers won't believe them, nothing will be helpful. And so, you know, one of the things that I think gets sort of brushed over and people don't realize is that anybody can be raped. You know, women are much more likely, and trans and non-binary folks than men, but men can be and are raped. And in fact, when men are raped, it's often by other men, again, as like a power thing. And that makes it even harder for these often straight men to sort of grapple with. All social classes, so people tend to be like, well, I'm rich, that couldn't happen to me. Yes, it can, unfortunately, right? All ethnic groups. So there's nothing protective about your demographics, unfortunately. Let me see if I have some of these stats on here. Oh, my notes don't match up with this. I'm gonna have to redo my notes. I'm not quite sure why I didn't put these in the same order. This is a really important point for this one down here. So many victims are afraid that if they do report to the police and it does go through, that they will face retaliation, particularly if they know their assailant, which in the vast majority of cases they do. So someone hiding in the bushes with a knife and jumping out and raping someone is the least common way people are raped. It's most often someone you know. So some college sexual assault statistics, 20.7% of men reported unwanted sexual contact. So this does not necessarily mean rape, but it could be unwanted kissing, fondling, forced oral sex, things along those lines. And then 27.5% of women reported unwanted sexual contact. Women reported more use of physical force against them. And alcohol use was associated with higher rates of coercion. I think part of that is probably, unfortunately, we know there are many cases where people are drugged in their alcohol, right? It also obviously can impair your functioning. About 95% of attacks were unreported. So again, this idea that there's just, unfair numbers of these things being reported. No, the large majority still aren't being reported. 20 to 25% of women will be raped or experience rape during their college career. And about 90% of those college women will know the person who sexually assaulted or raped them. 42% of college women who are raped tell no one about the assault, so not even their roommates, close friends, family members. And there are 10 times more rapes reported to crisis lines than are reported to the police. And again, for all those reasons that we talked about on this slide, right? That people just think it won't help, nothing will happen, they won't be believed. Or that there will be retaliation. And in fact, for that reason, the Dear Colleague letter that outlined how Title IX should be used to address rape, sexual assault on college campuses, expressly says that retaliation against someone who reports is itself a Title IX violation. So just to like back up a little bit, Title IX until sort of 2012 era, everybody just thought it was about sports, right? The actual Title IX amendment says that basically there cannot be discrimination on the basis of sex in college athletics or educational athletics, school athletics at any level. But it's really about equal access to education in general. And so during the, it was the second Obama administration, Joe Biden in particular, this is a passionate issue for him. He was vice president at the time. He worked with the Department of Education to put out this letter saying, if you're sexually assaulted, sexually harassed on your college campus, and you now can't go to class, you don't feel safe, you are being denied your right to an equal education. So this is controversial, and during the Trump presidency, things were kind of walked back, and now, of course, they're changed again. But it's an interesting way of kind of looking at it. And it means things like domestic violence also fall under that as well. One thing I didn't mention about, again, why people may not report or go through the process of formal reports. So a rape kit, which is the medical procedure by which they gather physical evidence from you, including, semen, hair, if you've scratched the person and gotten their skin under your nails, right? They photograph you. First of all, that's very invasive, right? And you have to get it, I believe, within 72 hours of being assaulted. So you're sort of re-traumatized, even though people who do these are very well trained and try not to do that. Just the process itself is invasive. The other thing is, this is the only type of evidence collection where the burden monetarily falls to the victim. So because it is a medical procedure, it is not paid for by law enforcement typically. And so if your insurance doesn't cover it, it can be up to $3,000 to get a rape kit. So again, sort of imagine yourself in those shoes. Could you afford to just pay $3,000 out of pocket, right? And people are working to change that and working to get law enforcement to cover it, get insurances to cover it, things along those lines. And it's an easy justification to insurances because insurances want to save money in the long run. And people who are survivors of sexual trauma have a lot of not only mental, but physical issues that make them high users of the medical system. You know what? I think that's like a nice place to stop before we dive into talking about rapists, which is really heavy, obviously. So we'll stop there for today. We'll talk about the characteristics of rapists on Thursday and dive in more to some of these ideas about sexual assaults, and then start talking about some of the other types of victimization. So thank you all for your participation today. Again, I know this is a heavier topic, so thanks for bearing with us. There's a reason I saved this till the end of the semester when we all feel a little more comfortable with each other. So.